Agnes lived alone in the house at the end of Brookside Lane, a weathered brick cottage whose shutters sagged with age and whose garden had long since grown wild. Neighbors passed it daily but seldom gave it more than a glance. They knew someone lived there, of course, an elderly woman who walked her dogs in the early mornings, always bundled in her faded wool coat no matter the season. She was polite when greeted, nodding with a small, almost apologetic smile, but she rarely spoke. When she did, her voice was soft, cracked with years and something else, a kind of retreat from the world. Inside, the house bore the weight of solitude. The walls smelled faintly of dust and lavender polish. Photographs hung in mismatched frames. Agnes, a young bride beside her husband, who had died 2 decades ago. Agnes holding a newborn child, a daughter who had long since moved abroad. Agnes with a circle of friends who had all either passed away or drifted out of her life. Her companions now were her 2 dogs, an aging terrier named Mabel and a shepherd mix called Bruno. They were the reason she woke in the mornings, the reason she shuffled to the kitchen to scoop kibble into their bowls, the reason she muttered aloud as she moved through rooms that echoed with emptiness. Her days were quiet, measured out by routine. She rose with the light, fed the dogs, sipped tea by the window, and watched the neighborhood come alive. The mail arrived at noon. She sorted through it carefully, though it rarely contained more than bills and flyers. She might read in the afternoon, her eyes straining over the print of books she had read before, or she would listen to the radio, preferring the company of voices that filled her silence. At night she ate little, bread, soup, sometimes nothing at all, and then sat until sleep forced itself upon her. It was during one such evening, in the stillness between the 10 o'clock news and midnight, that her heart betrayed her. She had been sitting in her armchair, a knitted shawl around her shoulders, when the sudden pain seized her chest. She gasped, reaching for the table, but her hand struck the edge and knocked her teacup to the floor. Mabel barked sharply, and Bruno rose, pacing anxiously. But Agnes could not call for help. The pain radiated like fire, and then her legs gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the rug, her body jerking once before stillness overtook it. The house did not notice. The clock on the mantel ticked on. The radio whispered static until its timer shut it off. The dogs circled her, whining, nudging her with cold noses, confused by her silence. They waited for her to stir, to call their names, to fill their bowls. But she did not. By morning, the house smelled faintly different. Nothing obvious, just the first subtle note of something wrong. The mail was pushed through the slot as usual, landing unanswered on the floor. The dogs pawed at Agnes's body, whining, then retreated to the kitchen, hoping she would appear there as always. But hunger gnawed at them, and the bowls remained empty. Hours turned to days. The curtains stayed closed. The garden went untended. Neighbors noticed only that Agnes was not on her usual morning walks. Some assumed she was ill, others that her daughter had come to visit and taken her away for a time. No one knocked, no one checked. The cottage was always quiet after all. Inside, the air thickened. The dogs grew frantic. They drank from the toilet when the water in their bowls ran dry. They scratched at the back door, but no one let them out. Their cries went unheard, muffled by the walls. In their desperation, they returned to the body, to the one figure they had always trusted, the one who had fed them, held them, been their world. Hunger does not recognize loyalty, it only knows survival. And so, tentatively at first, then with the primal urgency of starvation, They turned to her. The house bore witness in silence. The clock ticked. The days passed. The air grew heavier, more oppressive. Flies gathered at the windows. Letters piled up by the door. Still no one came. It was nearly 2 weeks later when the first real sign of alarm reached the outside world. The mail carrier, unsettled by the uncollected stack of envelopes, mentioned it to a neighbor. The neighbor, frowning, admitted she had not seen Agnes in days. Another recalled that her curtains had not been drawn in the mornings. At last, suspicion outweighed indifference, and the police were called. The 2 officers arrived on a damp afternoon, their patrol car pulling up beside the overgrown hedge. They walked up the narrow path, boots crunching on gravel, and knocked firmly at the door. No answer. They knocked again, louder. The silence inside seemed unnatural. One officer tried the door. It was locked. They circled the house, peering through windows clouded with grime. In the living room, the curtains blocked their view, but a faint buzzing reached their ears. The smell met them before they found their way inside. It was unmistakable, the heavy, cloying stench of decay. The younger officer gagged, pressing a hand to his mouth, while the older one muttered under his breath and radioed for backup. They forced the door, and as it swung open, the smell surged outward, thick and suffocating. The interior was dim, curtains still drawn, the air stagnant. Papers lay scattered on the floor where the mail had slipped through the slot. The dogs barked once from the living room, thin, hoarse sounds, but did not emerge. The officers moved cautiously, their boots creaking on the floorboards. When they entered the living room, the sight froze them. On the rug lay what remained of Agnes. The shape was still hers in outline, but time and neglect had stripped away much of her dignity. The dogs lingered nearby, gaunt and wide-eyed, their coats dull, their tails low. They watched the officers without aggression, too exhausted for anything but confusion. The older officer swallowed hard, forcing professionalism into his voice. "Get animal control," he said to his partner, "and for God's sake, open a window." The younger officer obeyed, fumbling with the latch until fresh air seeped in, though it did little to mask the smell. He glanced once more at the body, then quickly away, bile rising in his throat. He thought of his grandmother, alone in her small house, and the image made his hands tremble. As the room filled with the sounds of radios crackling and footsteps approaching from outside, the stillness that had reigned for days was finally broken. Neighbors gathered at the gate, whispering, craning their necks to see. The story spread quickly. The old woman at the end of Brookside Lane had died, and no one had noticed. No one had come. Inside, the officers stood in the heavy silence, watching as their colleagues carried out their duties. The dogs were led away, whining softly, their ribs visible beneath their fur. The body was covered, lifted gently, and taken from the house. And in that moment, the cottage seemed to sigh, as if relieved to release its terrible secret. Yet the memory of those days lingered in the minds of all who learned of it. The idea that someone could vanish within their own home, unseen, unfed, unmissed, until only silence and hunger remained. That thought clung to them like a shadow. And though the house at the end of Brookside Lane stood empty, its shutters sagging and its garden overgrown, no one passed it again without shivering, without glancing at the windows and imagining the silence that had once reigned inside. For the world had moved on without Agnes, just as it moves on without so many. But within the walls of her cottage, the truth had unfolded with merciless clarity. That loneliness is its own kind of death, and that sometimes the only witnesses are those who cannot speak of it.